So once again, good morning and welcome everyone. So remember, yesterday we took a look at the very first domain that we have in the CISSP, which of course is security and risk management. Before we talked about security and risk management, we had earlier told you that in the CISSP that there are 8 domains. So we have the security and risk management, then we have asset security, then we have security engineering, then also communication and network security, then identity and access management, also security assessment and testing, then security operations, as well as software development security. So we took a look at security and risk management in yesterday's session, where we talked about concepts like the CIA, confidentiality, availability, as well as integrity. Then also, we talked about security control categories like our administrative, technical, as well as physical security controls. Then also how to protect our supply chain. We'll take a look at what to do for offshoring, outsourcing, and managing third parties. Then also talked about security policies and what should characterize our security policies, which of course will mention that our security policy must be generic and non-technical, that it should also integrate security into every business process and function. All your business processes and function should, of course, because we said a chain is as strong as its weakest link. Then aside from that, policy must also be reviewed and modified periodically, and it must support the vision of the organization. Then we also went ahead to take a look at computer crimes. We talked about major legal systems, civil law, common law, as well as religious law. We also took a look at intellectual property law. We'll talk about things like patent, trademark, copyright, trade secret. And then finally, we talked about, of course, we talked about risk management. Then finally, we now talked about BCP, which is business continuity planning, and steps that you can follow to create an effective BCP. So these were some of the things we did in yesterday's session. Please let me know if you have any question. Can you guys hear me? Please let me be sure you can hear me.
Good morning, Mr.
Okay.
Bali.
Good morning and welcome.
Okay.
All right. So
I want to ask.
Yes, please go ahead.
Yesterday, we looked at the formula for calculating risk analysis, right?
Yes, you're right.
Yeah. Should we also have formula for calculating the quantitative or qualitative?
Good. That's a very good question. So for the qualitative risk analysis, remember I told you that the qualitative risk analysis is more of subjective method of doing analysis. So if you're doing qualitative risk analysis, the process is a bit different. And so in qualitative risk analysis, this is how you do qualitative risk analysis. Just to be sure you can see my screen. So you have the risk column. So as usual, maybe you have a serial number, then you have your risk column. So let's say, for example, we're talking about want to carry out a risk analysis to find out if to find out the probability of let's say we're developing an application, for example. So we are doing a risk analysis, we're doing a qualitative risk analysis to find out the risk that we face in that particular app development. Say the app we're developing is for the purpose of ordering food. That's the purpose for which we're developing the app. So we're doing it for food ordering, as it were. So we're doing some form of risk analysis to be able to determine the risk that will likely face. So if you're doing a qualitative risk analysis, so what you're just going to have will be your risk column. So where you now identify the risk that you may likely face. So in this case, the risk you may likely face can include maybe risk of hacking. Then aside from that, you can also have regulatory risk. Then you may also have, let's say, network availability. This is Nigeria. And other major infrastructure risks like, let's say, power availability. So all of these are some of the risks that we have been able to identify, especially for this particular project that I made mention of. So in qualitative risk analysis, here you now determine the probability that the risk will happen, and then you determine the impact if eventually the risk happens. That's what you do using the qualitative risk analysis. So probability, you use a range of values, maybe between 0 to 1. Then impact, you can also use a range of values, maybe between 1 to 10. So you can see, we're not really quantifying it in monetary terms. That's why we're using a range of values. So it's just to give us an idea of how severe that particular risk is. That's what the qualitative analysis does for us. So here we now begin to carry out our analysis. We'll talk about hacking. And what's the probability that hackers may want to hack that application that we're developing? So because it's a trading app, we can just give it a 50% probability. Then what will be the impact? Of course, you need to define this impact. Let's say 7, 8, 9 will be high. Then 4, 5, 6 will be medium. 1, 2, 3 will be low. So since this impact will be high, we might give it a 9. Then regulatory issues. Again, let's say this is a 50% chance of happening. Then what will be the impact? Of course, regulation is always very high. Then aside from that, you now talk about network issues. Let's say probability that this may happen is low. But again, if it happens, it will give us high impact. Power, obviously, probability that there's going to be power outage is almost certain. Then what will be the impact? Again, if we don't have power, we cannot work because most of our systems will require power to be able to work. So what we have done now is we have determined the probability and the impact. So based on the determination of the probability and the impact, we now determine what we refer to as our exposure factor. So the exposure factor will be a combination of the probability and the impact, multiplying both of them to give you the exposure factor. So if we do 0.5 times 9, this will give us 4.5. 0.5 times 10, this will give us 5.0. 0.3 times 8, this will give us 2.4. And then 0.9 times 10, this will give us 9.0. So the idea with the qualitative risk analysis is, you can see, what is just showing us is the most severe risk. Unlike when we did quantitative, that it actually measured it in monetary terms and showed us we're able to use it to do cost-benefit analysis and also determine our cost savings if we implement any of those countermeasures or safeguards, as the case may be. But all of that information you can't get from a quantitative analysis. Quantitative analysis will barely show you just the ranking for your risk. So from the outcome of this analysis, one can conclude that for the purpose of this our project, our number one risk that we should focus on should be the risk of power outage, then followed by regulatory risk, then followed by hacking, and then followed by network. This is the one we should least worry about. So this is a typical example of what you do in qualitative risk analysis.
All right. Thank you so much for the explanation.
Does that make sense?
Yes, please.
So I'm trying to share my screen. So in today's lesson, we're going to be taking a look at asset security. Asset security. Yesterday, I defined the term asset. I said asset is anything of value. So something of value can be tangible. It can also be intangible. We're going to be taking a look at these topics under asset security: classifying information and supporting assets, determining and maintaining ownership of assets, also identifying ways to protect privacy, also ensure appropriate data retention, determine data security controls, and then also establish what we now call asset handling requirements. Now, with regards to asset security, this is very, very important because not just is it important for us, we need to maintain security of those things that we find valuable within the organization. So a typical example, of course, is what this particular case study here is saying. So I'll read it out, and then we're going to discuss it as a class. Recently, a hacker broke into one of the Nutri Worldwide servers, taking advantage of an application vulnerability. The server had various types of information at different levels of criticality. Information on the server was secured with appropriate security controls. Although the hacker was able to gain access only to the information with lower levels of protection, the breach had a huge impact on the organization. It was later found that there was flaw in the classification process, leaving even sensitive information with very little protection. What do you make out of this case study? What can you make out of this?
For me, I think the flaw is from the classification process. Now, classification process is very critical when you come to security, and it is not done. If the classification is not done properly, that is, what are the things, what classes of infrastructure is to be protected and how they should be protected. We need to really understand that. For example, we want to know in classifying which one is server and which one is applications, and what level of rights should be given to each person. So if this is not properly done, it will create a vulnerability in the system.
You're right, absolutely. And I couldn't agree with you any less because you just nailed it. This particular case study is basically talking about the importance of asset security. And it also highlighted the consequences of inadequate classification and protection of data. So it basically is trying to explain to us why proper classification and protection of data is absolutely necessary. So this is very important. And in line with the CIA principle that we discussed yesterday, confidentiality, integrity, and availability. So concepts like the CIA, of course, will help to show that not all data is equally valuable. You know how in animal farm, we say, yes, all animals are equal, but some are more equal than others. So the different data have degree of validity or degree of value. So that's why we need to classify them correctly in order to ensure their proper protection. Because if you have a situation where, for example, sensitive information, you give it a lower level classification, it means if it goes out, it's probably going to have a severe impact on the organization. So that's part of the reason why it's quite necessary to do information classification. And talking about information classification is something that we all do, whether consciously or subconsciously. We started this class yesterday and we introduced ourselves. But then if you notice, the introduction just stopped at some point in terms of maybe you tell us your name, maybe what you do and why you want to do this course. Nobody now went ahead to now begin to talk about his family history or health history or background or education, because we've determined subconsciously that we don't need that information for this particular session. So that's part of the reason why we do information classification. So people have different reasons why they do information classification. The same also in an organization, we should also classify information so that only people, based on availability, who need certain information to be able to do their work would have access to such information. And that's why we mentioned that the reason to classify information would include the following. Because one, some data is valuable to people who take strategic decisions. So you don't want that data to be at the beck and call of every other person. Aside from that, some data loss could create a significant problem to the enterprise. So it simply means that if we lose that particular data, it's going to have a major problem for the enterprise. Then information classification can also help us to enhance confidentiality, integrity, and availability. It also focuses on proper implementation of controls depending on the sensitivity of the information. The first level is to classify the information before you even begin to talk about controls to put in place. Controls will now include creating user profiles and mapping out what each user can have access to. And that's one of the key things that control would help us accomplish. So if we now take a look at information classification, we all do some form of information classification for one reason or the other. Remember, like I was saying when I was starting this session, that everyone does some degree of information classification. So we all fall under the description of what we refer to as general. So in essence, the general public. We do information classification consciously or subconsciously in order to minimize risk of sensitive information. I won't just come and meet you the first day and begin to tell you everything about me. Even people who are closest to you, there are some information that you don't disclose to them. Well, even though marriage should be an open institution. But then again, sometimes there are certain things that you just decide to keep to yourself. There are certain things that you tell your parents and you don't maybe tell to your partner. There are some you can tell your partner and you don't tell your parents. There are some you can tell your siblings. There are some you can tell your friends. So we all have, that kind of way we classify information, what should go out and what this person should hear. And the reason why we're doing that is because we want to see how to minimize risk on sensitive information about ourselves. The government or the military sector also does information classification in order to avoid unauthorized disclosure. Then the commercial as well as private sector, they also do information classification. Yeah, of course, part of the reason they do this is to maintain competitive edge. So for companies in the commercial or private sector, their focus is basically on protecting intellectual property, things like their trade secrets, proprietary information, because all of these things help to give them competitive advantage. So if they lose this data to competitors, this could, of course, harm their business. Let's say, for example, a tech company that has developed a unique algorithm or maybe a unique software, for example, for a particular product. If the competitor gets access to such information, the tech company is at the risk of losing its market competition. So you can see why there's a need to do what we refer to as information classification. So in order to carry out information classification, different sectors have different levels of information classification. We're going to take a look at them, of course, individually, beginning with the government as well as the military sector. So the government or the military sector has various classes of information classification, and these are the various stages of information classification that we have in the government or the military sector. So the highest level of information classification, of course, is the top secret. So top secret basically refers to information that can cause exceptionally grave damage to the national security of a country if it is disclosed. Example of such top secret can include maybe military operations, or maybe we have some kind of a defense technology to protect our people. So only individuals with the highest clearance in the military or government sphere can access this level of information. This is arguably the most sensitive data, and that's part of the reason why it should be a top secret. Then we also have secret information. These are information that could cause serious damage to the national security if disclosed. For example, some form of government communication, some sting or intelligence operation. So this classification is highly sensitive. The risk of disclosure may not be extreme as you have for top secret, but then it can also have some major consequences on the country. Then we have confidential information. Confidential information basically is the information that could cause damage to the national security if it is disclosed. For example, some internal government reports or maybe lower level intelligence data that we gather. So this classification, of course, could be used for certain things, maybe, for example, procurement, administrative document, some form of contract. Then we also have what we call the SBU, that is sensitive but unclassified. So this is information that is not classified, but it still requires protection because of its sensitivity. Things like personal data for government workers or military personnel, certain law enforcement information. So this does not pose any secret or rather any major risk to the national security, but we still need to protect it because of the sensitivity of such information. Majorly because many of this information can infringe on personal rights or privacy of the individual. Then we now have unclassified information. This is information that is not sensitive and has no risk if disclosed. So here, these are information that is usually made available to the general public, things like government reports, press briefing, press releases. The information is freely available, maybe on a website, a notice board, and it doesn't require any special handling or protection. All of that falls under the definition of unclassified. So it is quite necessary to understand this, especially for the purpose of the exams. Beyond that, if we now take a look at the private sector, the private sector also has its own way of classifying information. And these are the levels of information classification within the commercial or the private sector. So the levels, of course, includes confidential, private, sensitive, and restricted, as well as public. So confidential is the highest level of classification in the private sector. So confidential simply means that these are sensitive business information. In many cases, should be used within the organization. And that's part of the key things that confidential information refers to. Example of confidential information can include your trade secrets, your strategic plans, plan to release a new version of the iPhone. That can be classified as confidential. Your proprietary software code, Maybe you also have merger and acquisition plans. You want to acquire another company. You don't want to make it open before others will take advantage of it. These are part of what we may refer to as confidential. Then we also have what we refer to as private. Private sometimes is also known as personal information. So this is information that is related to the employee, your customers, your clients, your stakeholders, or people that you deal with. All of these fall under private or personal information. Again, this information should be protected. Employees' data, for example, employees' payroll data, your customer contact details, medical records, all of these fall under what we refer to as private information. We need to keep them secure because of privacy regulations. Privacy regulations like the GDPR that you have in Europe, General Data Protection Regulation, or HIPAA like you have in the US, or NDPR like you have in Nigeria. We also have sensitive as well as restricted information. So this is information that is sensitive, but may not be as critical as confidential data. So the data is usually restricted to certain employees or maybe certain departments. For example, certain contracts, internal memo, or maybe you can also talk about your pricing strategy. This data is actually very valuable, especially to decision makers within the organization, and therefore it needs protection. It may not cause severe damage if exposed, for example, but if competitors or unauthorized individuals have access to it, it could harm the business. And then the final one is now public information. So this is information that is made available to the general public. This type of information does not pose any risk to the general public. Typical example can include company press releases, all those information you have on your company's website, product brochure, your flyers, marketing materials. So public information is usually made open and available, can be shared without restriction. And then, of course, you also need to put it into consideration that you need to put relevant measures in place to be able to determine when this information is beginning to go across board. Why do I mention this? Because there are cases where people use this source of public information to now probe and gather some other information about the organization. We refer to it as social engineering or social engineering attack. So maybe the person will be acting like he's making inquiries about the product that you guys offer or sell. And in the course of that inquiry, the person now begins to ask you certain other sensitive information that are private or sensitive or even confidential. So it is very important that you train your team on how to relate and communicate public information and to also be able to detect when a social engineering attack may be happening. So to enable us effectively handle data, there are now what we refer to as roles responsible for data classification. The roles responsible for data classification, of course, include, we have the role of the data owner. We also have the role of the data custodian. So within the organization, the data owner is the person or entity that is responsible for managing and classifying the data. So the data owner is actually the person who should do the information classification. So they play a key role in ensuring that the data is protected and also making sure that it is accessible and categorized based on value as well as sensitivity. So some of the responsibilities of the organization, of course, when it comes to responsibilities of the data owner, would of course include the data owner knows the use and value of the data to the organization. And that's one of the reasons why the data owner is responsible for ensuring proper classification of such information. Aside from that, the data owner also has a responsibility to annually review data classification. You must do this on a regular basis. This, of course, would help you to determine how data is classified in order to ensure that it is still accurate. If, for example, there is a change, you need to also make sure that we classify information and that the information aligns with the current state of the organization. So you may have a situation where certain data that hitherto were referred to as low risk may become sensitive if, for example, regulation of business processes change. Those are some of the things you need to put into consideration. So beyond the responsibility of the data owner when it comes to information classification, the organization also has a role to play. So these are part of the organization's responsibilities. The organization must track any deviations from the established data that or data classification protocols that we have put in place. So in a nutshell, if we already have classification, if there's a deviation from it, if there are things, any deviation from the established data classification protocol, the organization is bound to take action, corrective measures where necessary to be able to correct that. Let's say, for example, a sensitive data is mistakenly marked as public or are not protected data. As an organization, we must act to correct the mistake and ensure that proper security is reinstated for such data. The organization also has a responsibility to ensure that the data is retained based on the organization's retention policy and subsequently destroyed in a secure manner, making sure that the data does not stay beyond the amount of time that it should be retained based on your data retention policy, and also securely destroyed when it is no longer needed. So let's say, for example, a company might retain an employee's record for like 7 years, and then after which they must securely delete that particular record in order to prevent potential leaks. Part of the reason why this is important is the longer you keep data, the more the probability that the data might be compromised. So that's part of the reason why it is necessary that you determine what is the data life cycle. Different countries have specific amount of time, maximum, that you can keep certain data. So ensure that your retention policy aligns with that of the country or the rules as stipulated by the country. So all of these are part of the roles or responsibilities that the organization as well as the data owner plays when it comes to data or information classification. Let's take a look at this case study and you tell me what you make out of them. Network Firewalls Division has a lot of information that is created and maintained. However, Kevin, a security administrator at Military Worldwide Inc., recognizes that not all the information is critical and would like to do a high-level classification of the information accessible to him. What are the different classification levels Kevin would need to use?
Okay, this example, this is the private sector.
Correct.
So we need to apply the private sector data control, which we have the confidential, private, and then the third one is restrict, right?
Sensitive?
Yes.
And public. You're right, absolutely. So you should use private, confidential, sensitive, as well as public. So remember I was talking about when a data gets to the end of its life cycle, the data should of course be disposed. So it therefore means that part of your responsibility as a security professional is to do what we call data management. Data management basically talks about overseeing the entire life cycle of data within the organization. That's what we refer to as data management. Overall life cycle of data within the organization. So it means that as a security professional, you should be able to effectively manage data from when we acquire data up until the disposal of data. So typically, data life cycle includes the following stages. We have the data creation or collection process. That's usually the very first step or the first level of the data life cycle. Data creation, sometimes referred to as data collection. So this is where the data is first created or collected. It could be manually, it could be entering data in a system, it could also be automatically. Let's say, for example, intrusion detection systems gathering data, or maybe when a customer fills a registration form on your platform. All of these forms what we refer to as data creation stage. So at this particular stage, you need to ensure proper validation of the data. And please note that those are steps you need to take at this point. Proper validation simply means you need to be sure that the correct data, that's in order to protect the integrity of your data, that the correct data is what you are collecting or creating. Remember yesterday I gave an example of the organization where the salespeople were entering spurious data. And that's why sometimes if you check in some organizations, before, if you fill a form, it will ask you to go and confirm in your email because it's actually a security measure. That's a validation process. Or they will ask you to enter a unique code or to fill in a CAPTCHA because they want to validate the data and be sure that it is real you. Part of the security measures you also need to take care is to ensure secure transmission of that particular data before it goes into storage. All of these are measures that you take during the first level of your data lifecycle, which is the data creation and collection process. The second stage is now the data storage. This is the second level of our data lifecycle, data storage. So after we have collected or we've created the data, we now store it in our database. We can also store it in other storage systems. And the reason why we are storing it is to be able to access it in the future. So the customer has filled form online. Then the customer record is now stored in our secure server. Or maybe we have a database backend. So that's where the data now drops. That's what we refer to as storage. So again, at this point, there are certain security measures you need to take. Because we need to ensure protection of those data so that it doesn't get into the wrong hands. Things you can adopt can include encrypting sensitive data, then implement access control measures. Don't allow everybody now go and have access to that database or maybe to the storage within our server. This will help you to prevent unauthorized access as well as data breaches. Remember the case of the bank I told you it came to sell me data. These are part of the things you need to do to protect stored data. Then the third level of the data lifecycle is now the data usage. Data usage. And this is now where we access the data, where we process the data. And this should be used only by authorized individuals or maybe systems if we need to perform certain action. Maybe a marketer or a marketing team, for example, now uses those forms that have dropped and then begins to get back to them to find out when they want to make purchases and all of that. So that's what we call data usage. So part of the security measures you can put in place here would include to make sure that only authorized users can access those data. Then also audit the data itself in order to ensure the integrity of the data and be sure that it has not been corrupted over time. The fourth level of our data lifecycle is what we now refer to as data sharing or distribution. Data sharing or distribution. This is where we share data, maybe internally, or sometimes could also be externally. Say, for example, with employees, business partners, or even third party. That's what we refer to as data sharing. We're a hospital. So we have a case, a patient that we have been managing, and then the case now becomes very serious, and we need to transfer that patient to another bigger hospital that has bigger facilities. So it means we need to share the patient health records with that new hospital. That's what we refer to as data sharing. Sharing the data, again, security measures you need to take will include ensure secure transmission of the data. So you can choose to encrypt the data or anonymize it. Then make sure that it is in compliance with relevant privacy laws. Don't share people's data anyhow in contravention of relevant privacy laws. GDPR, HIPAA, NDPR, and the rest of them. And then we now have the fifth stage of the data lifecycle, which is the data archive or archiver. Especially for the PMP exam, this usually is a recurring decimal. So data is usually archived when the data is no longer actively in use, but could still be used sometime in the future, either for compliance needs, for legal needs, or even for business reasons. So let's say, for example, all dormant accounts in the bank, we archive all of those data. We don't just dispose them. The other day, they were saying federal government wants to clear all dormant accounts. Well, because we know that government can come tomorrow and they say they want access to those accounts. Aside from that, the customer can come back after 10 years and say, I've been away, I want to begin to run this account now. So that's what we refer to as archival. Again, data in archive needs protection. So they must be securely stored. They must also be protected from unauthorized access. That's part of the things that's why, when those accounts get into dormancy, you can't debit those accounts. It is because they are now in archive and they shouldn't be accessible immediately. We refer to that as data archival. And then the final stage of the data lifecycle is now what we refer to as the data destruction or deletion. Data destruction or deletion. So in essence, when data gets to the end of its life cycle simply means that the data is no longer needed. Sometimes it could also be that the retention period has expired, maybe due to regulation. GDPR says 6 years. So if the data has gotten to the end of its retention period, it needs to be securely destroyed as well as deleted. Typical example might include maybe you're deleting employee records or you're deleting, customers' records that have been there in archive for more than 6 years, as the case may be. Again, ensure secure deletion and destruction. You don't want to have what we call data remnants. When you think you're done, you don't know that data is still remaining in the disk or in whatever media that contain the data. Then somebody can piece it together and be able to gather such data. So that's why we said you should make sure that here, security focus should be that the data is completely and securely destroyed in such a way that it cannot be recovered by an unauthorized user. Wiping, shredding, destruction, degaussing, all of these are various data destruction methods that you may choose to adopt. So the whole idea of data management is how you're going to manage all of this life cycle of your data. That's basically what data management now portends. Managing the life cycle of your data to ensure that at each of these stages of your data life cycle, you implement all of those security functions as well as suggestions that I had talked about. So data management is needed to ensure that data complies to standard classifications, ensure data validity, ensure data integrity and consistency, and then also secure and maintain data. These are some of the reasons why we do data management. CISSP now gives us what we refer to as suggestions or best practices that we can adopt to enable us to effectively do our data management or to enable us effectively manage our data. So I'll read out some of those best practices. They include create a data management policy. So remember yesterday I was telling you things we're going to be looking at here will be purely or mainly from a manager's perspective. That's why if you notice, policy is always showing up every now and then. Because policy is usually the very first part of all of these steps. So as a manager, you're responsible for creating those policies, and the technical persons or employees are now responsible for implementing them. So you begin by creating a data management policy. The policy will outline how data should be managed throughout its life cycle. All of those things I've mentioned, from collection to storage to usage to deletion, policy should be clear on that. So the company's data management policy should specify all of those things like an encryption standard that can be adopted for sensitive data, how long the data can be retained, and then also at what point the data should be deleted or destroyed. Then also, other best practices for data management includes defining rules and responsibility for managing data, such as the role of the data provider, data owner, as well as data custodian. Clarifying the roles and responsibilities is quite important because it ensures accountability. So we know who is responsible for what. So each of these roles, they have their specific duties that is related to managing access as well as securing data. So for example, the data owner might be responsible for determining how the data should be classified and assessed, while the data custodian manages the infrastructure. For example, the databases, the servers. So if, for example, the data is stored within a particular server. Then the third one talks about auditing of effectiveness of controls, processes, as well as practices. Meaning, we should have regular audits to ensure that the organization's data management processes are effective as well as up to date. So this will help us identify any gaps or weaknesses that could lead to data breaches. So it means that you need to conduct a periodic review of data access logs to ensure that only authorized personnel are accessing sensitive data. Then set up procedures for quality control as well as assurance. So these procedures will ensure that data is being managed in an accurate as well as reliable way. Quality control is very important because this will help us to make informed decisions based on the data. So we can include implementing checks for data consistency, completeness, and making sure that data is validated during entry or even during migration. Also, establish processes for verifying and validating the accuracy and integrity of data, meaning that data must be regularly validated as well as verified to make sure that it is correct. This is important for maintaining trust in the data's integrity. Then, we also need to document specific data management practices and describe metadata for each data set. Clearly documenting how the data should be handled, processed, and also describing will help to improve the transparency and consistency of how the data is used. The metadata would also help users to understand the context of the data. All of these are part of the best practices. Then follow a layered approach to data security. This basically means using multiple layers of defense. For example, using firewalls, encryption, authentication, in order to protect data from unauthorized access or attacks. Then, of course, clearly defining criteria for data access. You also need to determine what to refer to as access control for data. So this is quite essential. It helps us to ensure that sensitive data is only available to those who truly need it. Say, for example, access to an employee HR record. This might be restricted to the HR personnel or maybe the relevant department head, so that not everyone would have access to such record as the case may be. All of these and many more are part of the best practices. One of the key things we mention as part of the best practices is to define roles as well as responsibilities, because we say that defining roles and responsibilities will help in accountability, and that's absolutely necessary. So some of the roles and responsibilities that we have included the role of the data owner, the custodian, and we're going to take a look at some of those roles, beginning with the role of the data owner. So an information of data owner can be an individual or group that has created, acquired, or purchased the information. So the data owner basically is anybody or group within the organization that created the data, acquired, or purchased the information. So they are responsible for ensuring that the data is properly managed. Remember, we took a look at the role of the data owner earlier. Also ensuring that the data is properly managed and is aligned with the organization's goal. So let's say, for example, head of a particular department is the one that's responsible or purchased a particular information that's relating to the department's operations. So maybe, for example, sales data or customer feedback. So that particular head is responsible for managing that particular data in order to ensure that we're able to utilize it to meet the organization's goal. So that's part of the reason why here we have the responsibilities of the data owner, which would include determining how the organization's mission and strategic goals will be impacted by the information. So the data owner is responsible for evaluating how the data contributes to the overall organization's mission and goal. Then, aside from that, determining the cost of replacing the information. It means that the data owner must understand the value of the data and the potential cost that is associated with replacing it if it were lost or corrupted. Then understand the requirement of entities within and outside the organization for the information and the conditions under which it can be shared. Meaning that data owners need to ensure that they understand who needs access to the data, both inside and outside of the organization, and under what circumstances or conditions can the data be shared. Then recognizing when the information reaches the end of its life cycle and destroying it. I've talked about secure disposal and destruction repeatedly. So data owners are responsible for identifying when the data is no longer needed, or like I mentioned earlier on, the retention period has expired, and then ensuring that the data is destroyed securely. And these are part of the responsibilities of the data owner. In order to be able to do this, CISSP gives suggestions as to some of the best practices for data ownership. And we shall take a look at some of those suggestions, talking about data ownership best practices. So some of the best practices associated with data ownership are: you need to establish and document, one, the ownership of the data, meaning that the ownership should be clearly defined as well as documented, so that there is no confusion about who is responsible for the data. So you need to clearly identify who is responsible for maintaining the data, who is responsible for securing the data. So let's say, for example, in an organization, you can have a legal team. The legal team might be responsible for managing legal documents, while the marketing team might not be responsible for managing customers' data. You can see, that's what we'll talk about, establishing and documenting the ownership of data. Then intellectual property rights of data. It's very important to also establish who holds the intellectual property rights of the data. This would ensure that the property and sensitivity of that particular data, maybe things around trade secret or product design, is properly protected from unauthorized use. If, for example, as a tech company, we develop an algorithm, it's very important that the ownership of that data is documented in order to prevent competitors from copying it, and then also to determine who to be held accountable, just in case there's a compromise to that particular data. Also, policies for securing data and other controls. So it means that organizations must have clear-cut policies on how data should be secured, including things around the encryption, access controls, and then also backup procedures. So you should have policies that dictate that the ways to classify data. Then aside from that, that will now state that sensitive data must be encrypted both at rest and maybe in transit. And then policy clearly stating that only authorized personnel should have access to certain data based on a need to know basis. Then aside from that, other best practices for data ownership includes ensuring data compliance with laws and regulations. So the data owner needs to make sure that their data, as well as data management practices, complies with relevant laws and regulations. I've talked about GDPR, I've talked about HIPAA. So if you're handling, let's say, data for a EU citizen, for example, you need to make sure that you comply with GDPR by obtaining the person's consent and then also ensuring data protection. Then also finalize agreements for data usage by customers or users. Simply means that data agreement should be one of the key things that you should put in place when data is shared with external parties. There should be a contract or an agreement that should be signed that would dictate how the data should be utilized and the purpose for that particular data. All of these are part of what we have when we talk about finalizing agreement for data usage. If, for example, some of the services that we do or that you have received, maybe you're using a software as a service company. If you notice, most times there's usually a user agreement. There's usually a data usage policy. All of this is to ensure that as much as possible, we're effectively able to manage the data. Then beyond the role of the data owner, which of course we have taken a look at length, we also have the role of the data custodian as well as the role of the data steward. When we talk about custodian, the responsibilities of the data custodian as well as that of the data steward is basically what we're going to be taking a look at next. Don't forget, the data owner is the person who acquires or develops or purchases or created the data. So the data custodian as well as the data steward, these are now two other additional roles that you may have in managing as well as securing or safeguarding data. And talking about the data custodian, these are the responsibilities of the data custodian. The data custodian is responsible for safe custody, storage, and transportation of data, implementing the business rules, and then also technical environment and database structure. So note, the data custodian is mainly responsible for the technical as well as operational aspects of the data management. So in essence, they handle how the data is stored, how the data is transmitted, as well as how the data is secured within the organization. Those are the core responsibilities of the data custodian. So it means that this first point clearly states that the data custodian is responsible for safe custody, storage, and transportation of data. So as a custodian, the custodian must ensure that the data is stored securely, and then it is also safely transferred between systems without any unauthorized access or corruption. Then, aside from that, the data custodian also allows only authorized as well as controlled access. That's also another responsibility of the data custodian. So they must enforce rules that allow only authorized personnel to access data, making sure that permissions as well as access controls are in place, especially when it comes to data access. Then they should also help in preventing unauthorized access. Aside from that, they should also maintain versions of master data and then history of changes. That's what we mentioned here, maintaining versions of master data and history of changes. So the data custodian keeps track of the master data versions and ensures that there's a history of changes to the data. This is quite necessary because sometimes if you want to find out where a particular change emanated from or who made a particular change to a data, you might need to take a look at those history. The data custodian is also responsible for identifying data stewards for every data set. So it means that the custodian works alongside the data steward for every data set in order to ensure that there is clarity about roles that's related to the data content. Then also ensure data integrity is maintained in technical processes. So in essence, they ensure that technical processes, when we talk about technical processes, you're talking about things like backups, encryption, data validation. And so the data custodian also ensures that you maintain data integrity during all these technical processes. If you're doing backup, for example, in a situation where data gets corrupted, deleted, altered during the backup process, that's why we mentioned that you need to ensure you maintain data integrity. The custodian maintains data integrity during these technical processes. The custodian also ensures security controls safeguard data. So you also make sure that things like encryption, firewalls are in place in order to safeguard your data from breaches as well as corruption. Audit is also one of the major functions of the data custodian. So you audit the data content and changes, carrying out periodic audits. These are conducted to check the data integrity and also ensure that the data adheres to established rules. Then maintaining consistency with common data models. So this, of course, would ensure that the data is consistent and follows the common data models that are used within the organization. Aside from that, you may also, as data custodian, be responsible for maintaining the database with change management practices. So meaning that the custodians are responsible for managing and documenting any changes that is made to the database and making sure that such changes do not disrupt operations. So while the data steward, when we talk about the data steward basically focuses more on the business as well as content aspects of the data. So to make sure that it aligns with the overall organization's goals and objectives and also establish rules. So that's part of the reason why one of the key responsibilities of the steward is to ensure and be responsible for the content, context, the associated business rules for the data and information stored in the data field. When we talk about content and context management, we're simply saying that the steward is responsible for managing the content as well as the context, as well as the business rules that is associated with the data. Because this can include making sure that the data is quite accurate, that the data is consistent, is also aligned with the organization's goal. So this person works hand in hand with the data custodian to ensure that the data is consistent and then also ensuring that the data's content, maybe things like maybe the customer's name, address, and some other things like sales figure, transaction details, that these things adheres to the organization's business rules as well as policies. So you can have people who occupy different roles within the organization that can fill in these positions. So those who can be your data custodians can include maybe a data manager, project leader, database administrator, GIS manager, IT specialist, or even an application developer. Please let me know if you have any questions based on what we have discussed so far. Are we good? Is it safe to proceed?
On the data lifecycle, so is it compulsory to destroy data at the end of the day?
So many regulations have provisions for destruction of data. So in essence, there are certain data that when it gets to the end of its life cycle, it must be destroyed. So for such data, yes, it is compulsory to destroy the data at the end of the day. If you don't have any need for data, why keep it? Don't also forget that data sometimes can be a cost head because you're buying storage. It's as simple as your mobile phone now. You have pictures, you have videos, you have all the ones you've taken from 50 or 30 years ago. Sometimes I look at those pictures and then I smile. They give me memories. But then there are certain times I just look at them and I'm like, oh, it's time to say goodbye. And then I hit the delete button because I really do not need them anymore. So we're saying also, in that same context, any data at all that it has gotten to the end of its life cycle, it's no more used or useful for the organization, it actually makes sense to delete or destroy such data.
Okay, in other words, it is measured by the usefulness of data before you can determine if it should be deleted or destroyed. Right.
Not just the usefulness, but then also regulatory requirement as well. In fact, majorly regulatory requirement, especially GDPR. Are we together?
Yes, Mr. Swan.
Good. So I will now talk about data quality. The data quality is more or less measures that we can take in order to ensure some of the things that were mentioned when we're discussing data management. Remember, in data management, we talked about managing the life cycle of the data. And if you notice when I was discussing that, I made mention of a whole lot of things. I gave advice as to things we can do in order to enhance the safety as well as the security of data. In the same context, to be able to do that, most times you notice I kept saying, validate your data, validate your data. So data quality is basically the degree to which the data is accurate. That's what we call, well, ISO 9001. ISO 9000 defines quality as how well a product or a service meets requirements. So if you apply it to data, it's basically saying how well a data meets the requirement. In essence, the degree to which the data is accurate, the degree to which it is complete, timely, as well as reliable. And that's what we refer to as data quality. Because that's the only thing that will enable the data to serve its intended purpose, which is how we define quality, how well a product or a service meets requirement, fit for use and fit for purpose. So if you have high quality data, it will ensure that you're able to make good decisions and sound decisions at that. Whereas low quality data would give you the exact same opposite. So these are what we now refer to as principles, data quality principles. Remember, when we talk about principles, principles are more or less what we value, things that we hold dear. So data value principles, of course, would include. Now, we'll say that data quality principles apply to all stages of the data management process. From your data collection, don't forget that data quality starts from the level of your data collection. So you need to make sure that accurate and consistent data is collected, because if there's a mistake at this stage, during the collection of the data, maybe there's an input error or there's a missing field. Now, of course, this will now affect subsequent stages. If in the course of capturing customer's phone number, you miss a digit, or you mistype some digit or the name, or it would, of course, if you want to get in touch with that customer, what will happen? You will not be able to reach the customer. So you can see it becomes a big problem. During data recording, you also need to ensure proper recording of data in order to ensure that data is stored securely in the system. If you mislabel the data or miscategorize the data, it can reduce the usefulness of the data. Say, for example, our products have different codes. You now went and entered the wrong code in our inventory system. Our inventory will now be showing that we have 10 of those products. Meanwhile, it is counting a wrong product that was mistakenly entered in that particular space. You can see the impact that could have, as well as identification. So each piece of data needs to be uniquely identified. You know how we all have our unique phone number or unique account number? That's a typical example of what we call identification. So the unique identification will help to ensure that the data can be tracked, that the data can be spooled, that the data can be referenced. That's why your account number is unique and just for you alone, so that once we enter it, it brings out only you and only your detail. Imagine if we had a situation where we enter your account number and it's showing about 10 different people or 10 different names. So that's why we should ensure quality of identification, ensuring that you have a unique identifiable information, and the data is uniquely identifiable. Then also, metadata recording. Metadata will provide us a context about the data, more or less attributes about the data. That's what we mean by metadata. For example, things around the date the data was created, the data owner, the version, the history. So if you maintain a good metadata, this will help you to maintain control and consistency of your data management. You can trace your data, you can track your data, and you can connect your data. If you don't have proper metadata in place, one document could be mistaken for an outdated version. You can be referencing an outdated version, for example, not knowing that there's a newer version of that particular document, which can, of course, lead to wrong information. Aside from that, during your storage and archiving, data quality also needs to be ensured. So your data must be stored securely, and then also archive must also remain accessible and intact only to those who are authorized to have access. Then, during your presentation and dissemination of data, You need to also make sure that data is presented clearly and is also disseminated to the right audience. Aside from that, during the analysis and manipulation of data, data analysis phase now requires that the data be accurate and reliable, because poor data quality can make us have poor results or give us false outcomes, as the case may be. And this can, of course, lead to faulty analysis or even wrong conclusions. So if, for example, you're doing a simulation and you impute a wrong or inconsistent data input, you will notice that just like maybe you're running Monte Carlo, it is what you give it that is going to use to run the simulation and give you outcome. So if you input any inaccurate set of data, that's not what it's going to use to give you outcome, which of course could be forecast that you want to use in decision making. So that's part of the reason why, as much as possible, there's a need for us to ensure data quality. And in data quality, there are two major things we do. You can do quality assurance as well as quality control. Quality assurance focuses on the process, while quality control focuses on the product, meaning that as much as possible, we need to assess all the processes. That's why we say is the assessment of the quality based on standards external to the process. All the processes that are involved in data management, you need to be sure that they are consistent and being followed through. While quality control is now checking the final outcome of the data that you've collected, you need to also check the validity of the data. All of these things are part of what you do in quality assurance and quality control. So proper quality assurance and quality control would help us to be able to maintain our data quality. Is there any questions so far? Let's take a look at this case study and you tell me what you make out of it. With the rapid expansion in the collection and storage of digitized personal information of customers at Notary Worldwide Inc., the issue of privacy has gained significance. As the General Manager of IT Security, Hilda Jacobs is concerned as there are very stringent legal and regulatory requirements for the protection of privacy and data. She decides to implement a data management process in the organization. What is the first step Hilda must undertake to kickstart the data management process at Notary Worldwide Inc.?
That should be data collection and validity, at least validating the data. So,
what should guide the whole process of data collection, storage, and distribution?
Control.
Data management what? Something should specify now how you are going to do all these things. Remember one key thing I told you you do as a manager? Policy. The data management policy.
Policy.
Correct. And that's usually the first step in the whole process. First develop a policy, and then the policy will now guide subsequent steps or actions. Beyond that, another key thing we should also pay attention to is software licensing. This is very, very important. Remember, I talked about intellectual property earlier on. So you don't want a situation where you become, you're on the wrong side of the law because you're contravening the usage of a particular software. So as a security professional, part of the things you need to put into consideration is software licensing. Avoid copyright infringement. So make sure that your organization secures original copies of licensed software. Part of the things you need to put into consideration include avoid creating and installing illegal copies of software. This is very important to make sure that the software installed in the organization is legally purchased. If you're using pirated or unauthorized software, it can lead to several legal consequences. So let's say, for example, if an organization installs maybe an illegal version of a Microsoft Office, this can lead to violating copyright law. We also have what we call identity or identify unauthorized software installation. So it's also your duty as a security professional to identify unauthorized software installations. So you need to carry out regular audits as well as checks in order to make sure that no unauthorized or unlicensed software is installed on the company's computer. Don't forget that sometimes employees can be funny. they might install personal or maybe free software without the IT's knowledge or IT department's knowledge. And this software could be a security risk or violate licensing agreement. Then manage licenses properly. This is very important. So you need to keep track of your software licenses, including the expiry dates of your licenses, the usage rights, compliance with the number of installations that is allowed under the license. If it's a single user software, for example, there is no need you installing it in multiple systems so that this one can be using it and then we share that person's password with another user. Again, that will be contravening the licensing agreement. Aside from that, another reason why you need to manage licenses properly is because you want to be able to renew your licenses before expiration or on expiration. You don't want a situation where your business is disrupted, maybe because of software has expired, or you have a situation where maybe somebody now buys the rights to that particular software. So all of these things are part of the things you need to put into consideration when we talk about managing licenses properly. Then appoint a software or media librarian who is responsible for controlling media and software assets. A media librarian will be responsible for controlling and managing the organization's software assets. So especially issues with licensing and tracking software usage, ensuring that the softwares are renewed and updated. And these are some of the responsibilities of the librarian, the media librarian. So the librarian might track how many employees are using a license program, making sure that the usage does not exceed the number of licenses that are purchased. Now, these are some of the things you need to put into consideration, especially as it pertains to software licensing. Just like we have what we call a data lifecycle, and there's also equipment lifecycle. Remember, I said life cycle is the stage that anything goes through from start to finish. That's what makes up the life cycle of that thing. Every equipment that we buy also would have expiry dates from the point we purchase it up until the point when it is disposed. So that's why here we mentioned that every IT equipment in an organization has a finite useful life. So appropriate security activities should be carried out throughout the life cycle of the IT equipment. So specifically, how the organization should manage and secure their assets, their equipment throughout the life cycle. So during the first stage, which is the defined requirement, part of the things you need to put into consideration at that point will be security requirement as well as cost. In other words, if you're talking about having a discussion on purchasing an IT equipment, and you are at the requirement gathering stage determining which one to purchase or the basis upon which you're going to purchase it, we're simply saying put security and cost into consideration. Before you acquire an IT equipment, you need to clearly define the requirements. You need to also be sure about the security features and then also the cost associated with the purchase and maintaining these features. Why this is important is it will make sure that the equipment chosen will meet not just your operational needs, but then also your security requirements. So let's say, for example, we want to buy laptops for our employees. We need to also determine what's maybe the encryption capabilities of the laptop, capability with software security, then overall cost of the maintenance. Then the next stage of your equipment life cycle is the acquisition and implementation. So during this stage, this is where you procure the equipment, this is where you install it, or this is where you implement it into the organization systems. You also need to be careful and consider security features, things around the encryption, antivirus, as well as access control systems. Make sure that they are installed to ensure that the equipment is secure from the onset. If, for example, you purchase a new server, you need to ensure that the server is configured with firewalls, and then that the server is also updated with the latest security patches before you start deploying it. Then, for operation as well as maintenance, so in essence, once we have purchased the equipment and the equipment has now been deployed and it's in use, we need to monitor it and maintain it regularly. That's what we are saying here. Monitoring and maintaining it regularly means that it would also include all security software as well as systems, making sure that they are up to date, addressing any vulnerabilities that may arise over time. So we need to regularly update the operating system, ensure that we implement relevant security patches in order to prevent cyber attacks, carry out routine maintenance to make sure that the equipment runs efficiently. Then the last stage of our equipment lifecycle is the disposal or the decommissioning stage. We're basically saying that when the IT equipment reaches the end of its useful life, it must be securely decommissioned. That's what we're saying here. Making sure that it is securely wiped or destroyed, that there is no data remnants or any data that is still within the equipment. So for example, if you have an old hard drive and the hard drive has gotten to the end of its useful life, you don't just go and throw it in your dustbin. You may consider shredding it to make sure that sensitive data cannot be recovered from the hard drive, because if an attacker or maybe someone with nefarious intention lays hands on it, the person, of course, may use it to make carry out some other nefarious actions. So all of these things are some of the things you need to put into consideration, especially with regards to your equipment lifecycle. So data at every point or at every stage should be kept secure as well as protected. When we talk about data at any stage, it could be data at rest. It could also be data in transit. Data at rest simply means data in storage or maybe data in an archive. Those are what we refer to as data at rest. While data in transit could be maybe data that is being shared or data that is being used or data that is being passed across the network. So data that is stored, that is data at rest, either on a physical or cloud storage, maybe like your hard drive, databases, or backups. That's what we call data at rest. In other words, they are not actively moving through a network. For such data, controls that you can implement can include implementing encryption. And that's one of the major controls you can implement for data at rest. Encrypting the stored data would ensure that even if someone gains unauthorized access, they cannot read or misuse the data without the encryption key. You can also consider hashing. Hashing can be used to check the integrity of the data to ensure that the data has not been tampered with. So it will create a unique fixed size signature, which we normally refer to as hash for the data. Then also compressing. So if you compress data, this can help you save storage space, which also can add a layer of difficulty for unauthorized access. Then implement strong password. So enforcing strong password policies for accessing stored data can add also an additional layer of security. Labeling and marking. So when we label data, we're simply saying that data should be labeled properly and marked in order to indicate the classification levels. Labeling can include clearly indicating on the data, maybe for example, confidential, or maybe for example, sensitive. That's what we refer to as data labeling as well as marking. Then also storage and documentation. So you need to ensure that the physical or cloud storage location that you're using is secure and safe. And then also maintain clear documentation of data handling. You can use encryption tools for the purpose of encryption, like self-encrypting USB drives. So these devices, they automatically encrypt data that is stored on them, making sure that the contents are secure. There are also file as well as media encryption softwares that you may also consider. They are tools that, of course, ensure that files and media are stored in an encrypted manner. For data in transit, this is basically data that is actively moving across networks or maybe through systems, such as maybe data you're sending via email, or maybe you're doing a file transfer, or you're doing a database query, for example. So for security controls that you may want to consider, again, encryption and hashing can also be one of the key things that you need to put into consideration. Using cryptographic methods, all of this will ensure that the data is protected while it is in transit. And if it is intercepted or tampered with, of course, the person will not be able to decode or make sense out of it. There are different types of encryption, which of course can include doing an end-to-end encryption. That is, data is encrypted, but the routing information remains visible. So here, the data is encrypted from the sender to the recipient, but then the routing information remains visible. For example, your WhatsApp. Then, of course, we also have link encryption, where both the data as well as the routing information are encrypted. This one offers a higher level of security, especially for very sensitive and confidential data. So for data that is in transit, these are some of the best practices that CISSP actually recommends. They include using a secure socket layer, SSL, or transport layer security, TLS. Encryption has been talked about repeatedly, so make sure you encrypt your data in transit. Also, pretty good privacy and secure multipurpose internet email extension for encryption. End-to-end encryption might also be considered, and then also secure shell. All of these are measures that you can take in order to effectively protect data in transit. So in this particular lesson, we took a look at asset security, and we talked about measures that we can take to protect things that are valuable to us as an organization, and those are what we refer to as assets. So we talked about measures to be able to do that, including ensuring how we are going to be protecting information classification. Now we talked about classifying information, whether government or military classification, and then also private classification. For government, we talked about top secret, confidential, sensitive, and then unclassified. While for private, we talked about confidential, private, sensitive, and restricted, as well as public. We also took a look at data management and data management best practices. We talked about data ownership as well as data custodian. We also talked about data quality, quality assurance and quality control, equipment lifecycle, and then also how to protect our data, both data at rest as well as data in transit. Is there any questions so far? Thank you so much for watching. I hope this particular session has been very informative for you. Don't forget to like, comment, as well as share this particular video. You can also subscribe to my YouTube channel. You can also sign up as a member of this particular channel and you will be getting a whole lot of benefit as a member. You can also decide to sign up for any of our upcoming CISSP training or system security course, whether it is CISSP or CISA or CISM or CompTIA Security Plus. We are there to help you cover and most importantly, help you get certified at one sitting once you take the exam. Thank you so much for watching. In the next domain, we shall take a look at security engineering.